Now, in addition to the other things that TR was going to work on during his presidency, two other things were going to be of great importance to him. Now, one because of his background and the fact that he really had built himself up by being an outdoorsman. That's going to be the environment. And the other thing is going to be health in general. Now, some of this does go back to when he was younger and he was not in the world's best health. He had things I said before, like asthma and whatnot. But health and the environment are going to be two areas that are going to be of great concern to TR. Now, some of this is going to be, like I said, because of personal experience. Other aspects of this are going to be as a result of things that are going on. There are going to be different issues that come up during the course of his presidency, like the coal strike, that were not anticipated yet still had to be dealt with. So you're going to see a few more things like that coming up at present in regards to his administration. Now, the world in which we live today, we don't have a great deal of concern over the food we eat and the medicines we take. But back during this time frame, there weren't as many guarantees, shall we say. If you go to the store today and you purchase something that says 100% ground beef, well, then by law, it must be 100% ground beef. It can't have anything other than beef in it. Back during this time frame, however, that wasn't necessarily the case. Same thing could be true of the medicines people were taking. It may say A, B, C, or D, and it may or may not have that. Recently, within the last few years, there was a big scandal in that there was a blood thinner that had been imported from China that actually went through and turned out to just be water, and so it had no effect whatsoever. So the regulation of food and drug, the ability to go through and make sure that there were some standards and whatnot in regards to the food and medicine that people were actually ingesting, well, that got to be quite important to Teddy Roosevelt. Now, there was a muckraking journalist, a guy by the name of Upton Sinclair. He wrote a book called The Jungle. Now, The Jungle was a book originally, the point of the book and what he was trying to get across was how bad the working conditions were for immigrants at that time. And for specifics, he was using the meatpacking industry in Chicago. Now, you think about it, you have cows, pigs, things like that, the various meats that people eat. They would, the animals would come to the slaughterhouse, they would then be, cut up into various different, be it steaks, be it hamburger, be it whatever. Well, the meatpacking industry at this point in time, they used a lot of chemicals to the point that people's fingers would actually burn off after working there for a certain amount of time. That was the kind of thing that Upton Sinclair wanted people to know about. He wanted them to know about the harsh working conditions, the low pay, the bad hours. Basically, he wanted people to see how bad it was. But the public didn't really pay that much attention to that aspect of the book. Instead, what they paid attention to was the horrible conditions in which the meat they were eating was being processed. Okay, you would have them, talking about that, like in the machines that would grind the meat up and whatnot. You would have, stuff would be swept in there. Maybe rats would fall in and get ground up into the meat, or cat, or something like that. Or there were even anecdotal, unproven stories that every once in a while a person would fall in and get ground up into the meat. There was a sarcastic poem at the time that actually said, "Mary had a little lamb, and when she saw it sicken, she sent it off to Packingtown, and now it's labeled chicken." That was the kind of thing that people took away from the book. And TR was one of the people who had read the book and was disgusted by the meat packing industry. His stomach was turned by all the stuff that was going into the food that people were eating. And so he started to push for something called the Meat Inspection Act. The idea was to make sure that the meats being used and sold to the public were actually good. It wasn't like, meat that had gone bad or meat from diseased animals or things along those lines. So he's going to push for this Meat Inspection Act, and it does get passed in 1906. Now, There are some different requirements as a result of this, and a lot of these are still exactly the same today. It is the idea that now you're going to be secure in the knowledge that the meat you're eating is actually what it claims to be, first and foremost. Secondly, you're not going to have to be concerned whether or not you're going to get sick from eating it. You're not going to have to be constantly wondering if it's worth the risk. Okay, so it passes in 1906. And it calls for a number of things. For example, strict cleanliness requirements for meat packers. There were a number of different requirements for the meatpacking industry as a result of this. We're talking about different things like the knives being used and things like that had to be cleaned periodically. You had to have the ability for people to, simple things like wash their hands. There were a number of different requirements. So as the people were going through working on the meat, working on like the side of beef or whatnot, there would be less chance of some kind of either spoilage or some kind of contamination that would make the meat inedible, or at the very least, trying to prevent things that were going to make people sick. Now, we still hear a lot about things like this when they'll talk about possible outbreaks of things like E. coli and whatnot. And this all can trace its way back to the Meat Inspection Act. Another aspect of this was the program of meat inspection. You'll see different, things, meat stamp, USDA choice or something like that. And what that is, it's different qualities of meat, higher quality versus lower quality. That way, again, you know what you're getting. You're not going through and you're not paying top dollar for something that turns out to be, the low end cut of meat. It is, again, that concept of truth in advertising. Okay, we talked before about like the snake oil salesman going through a town with the ointment that would cure everything from baldness to cancer. Well, again, people wanted honesty. They wanted to know that what they were purchasing and what they were going to be eating was actually on the up and up. And so you had this federal meat inspection program now in place where they would go through and they would grade the different meats and whatnot, and you really knew what it was you were purchasing when you went to the store, and bought, some kind of meat or something like that. Another piece of legislation around this time was something called the Pure Food and Drug Act. Now, we mentioned the snake oil salesman. We mentioned previously that you would have all these different remedies that were predominantly just alcohol and things like that, and really ended up doing more harm than good. Well, now we're going to try and go through and fix that problem. Same year, it's still 1906. Congress is going to pass something called the Pure Food and Drug Act. Okay, so we already have the Meat Inspection Act, so that we have the government now is taking an active role in going through and making sure that the food, the meat that we're actually eating is edible. It's not going to make people sick. Well, at the same time now, we're looking at trying to make sure that the food and medicines that we're taking are actually going to be good for us as opposed to a problem. It halted the sale of contaminated foods and medicines. Now, before this, we really lived under the theory of caveat emptor. Now, that's Latin for let the buyer beware. The idea being that it's really your own responsibility to make sure that the food and medicine you're taking is on the up and up. If it's not, well, basically that was your problem. And the idea was that the free market would take care of that, that if there was a company producing shoddy goods, cruddy stuff like that, that people would learn quickly not to purchase that particular product and that company would go out of business. But there was at this time still a lot of contaminated food and medicines were being sold to consumers. And what's more, the consumers really didn't know that they were taking such a large chance. They thought that everything was on the up and up. Sometimes people got sick, sometimes they were okay. It just all depended. Now, the Pure Food and Drug Act called for truth in labeling. Now, we all know today you can purchase any food item or whatnot, and they will have a list of all the ingredients therein. Same thing is true for medicines today. You can find out exactly what's in them. Well, before that, there was no requirement. Now, some people did go through and do this, and they did, basically tell people what was in the product, but there was no requirement to do that. It was totally up to the producer. They could decide to either do it or not. Well, now the federal government is going to require it. Okay, if you look on, bag of chips or candy bar or anything today, it's going to list all the ingredients that went into the making of that product. We're going to have truth in labeling. Now, if you are a company and you are not 100% honest, if you have a tendency to kind of, you know, bend the truth is maybe the nicest way to put it, then you can end up going to prison as a result of it. It not only called for truth in labeling, it required it. It required that you, as the producer, list everything that you had put into that product. Now it was not so much a case of caveat emptor. It wasn't so much that the consumer was on their own, good luck to you. Now you actually had the federal government on your side trying to help make sure that the food you were eating or the medicines you were taking, all this stuff that's going into you, is not going to harm you. It's the idea that the food and the medicine are supposed to help, not hurt. And now, for the first time, we're seeing the federal government actually be involved and forcing the producers to do so on pain of going to prison.
Now, to move on from bad food and bad medicine and things like that, we're going to go to another aspect of life that was near and dear to the heart of President Roosevelt. Now, remember, we said that he'd had asthma as a child and he sort of built himself up through outdoor life, things like camping, hunting, fishing, things along those lines. He was an avid outdoorsman. He really enjoyed it. And as such, he felt that, in all honesty, the natural resources, the various wild places that the United States still had at that point in time were a national heritage, something that needed to be conserved. And so you're going to see conservation and natural resources come to a very important crossroads when it comes to the Roosevelt presidency. Now, you have to take into account that before this point in time, natural resources within the United States really didn't get a lot of attention. It was all seemingly endless. It seemed like we had a boundless supply of fill in the blank, and that could be timber, it could be coal, it could be, whatever. The idea was that really you didn't have to worry about replenishing these natural resources, you could just use them. Well, TR was very concerned over that. He realized that as certain natural resources were lost, they could not be replaced. The idea behind deforestation, for example, the idea of clear cutting, while that can recover, it was still a massive point of concern for Teddy Roosevelt. He had enjoyed the outdoors and he wanted all Americans to be able to enjoy the outdoors in the exact same way. Now, there was a gentleman at this time named John Muir, name you might or might not be familiar with. He was a naturalist and he was a writer. And he really was the one who was able to convince Teddy Roosevelt to set aside 148 million acres of both forest and other land for preservation and conservation. Now, an acre is close to, it's not exactly, it's a bit smaller than, but think about a football field. Essentially, what John Muir was able to convince Teddy Roosevelt to do was to take approximately 148 million football fields and set them aside. You're going to see the creation of the first national parks. You're going to see the desire of the federal government for the first time, really, to preserve some of these wild spaces for people to enjoy. Instead of it simply being a resource that could be exploited, it was becoming a resource that could be used. It wasn't just about getting there first, getting all of whatever, and then never worrying about it again. It was the way to go through and use it sustainably, to replenish trees that were cut down and things like that. So TR is going to set aside, like I said, 148 million acres of forests and whatnot in order to preserve them for future generations. His theory was essentially that while in Europe you had these various paintings and museums and things like that, that they had a cultural heritage that way, the wild spaces of America, the forests and the outdoors and whatnot, that was for us to hold on and to pass on to future generations as our cultural heritage. So he does set all of this land aside. And he appoints a gentleman by the name of Gifford Pinchot as the head of the U.S. Forest Service. Now, this is the first time we've had that. Now, the Forest Service is still in effect today. You go to any of the national parks and you're going to see the U.S. Forest Service is very much involved in making sure that everything is run smoothly. Has it always worked out perfectly well? No, of course not. Have there been hiccups along the way? Have there been problems and scandals? Yes, of course. But Teddy Roosevelt really started things. And his theory was that you could put aside land like this. You could have it being run by like the Forest Service and still use it without overuse. It was the idea that you could go through and still use the natural resources that the United States had without exhausting them right away. We wanted to go through and basically TR wanted to set up a system in which the natural resources could be used without being depleted. And so we're going to see along the lines of that what are referred to as conservation measures. It is the idea, and this was one used by both Teddy Roosevelt and the head of the Forest Service. They believed in the conservation of land. They did not believe that all land should be kept exactly like it is, never touched, never used, anything like that. That was not the point of conservation. The point of conservation was to go through and hold on to some of the wild land to keep it that way. But in all honesty, Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, they believed some land should be developed and some land should be preserved. And the development could be for any number of things. It could be developed for the use of logging, for example, or it could be preserved for agriculture or building or different things along those lines. The idea wasn't that they were trying to make sure that every square foot of the United States remained exactly the way it was when they started all this. Instead, they wanted to find some kind of middle ground, some way in which you could go through and still preserve large areas, but at the same time continue to use the natural resources. Teddy Roosevelt went through and he preserved some land and transformed other land for agriculture. Now, there is still a number of questions to this very day as to whether or not that all worked out perfectly or not. And again, this is one of those things that I really have to leave to you to determine for yourself. But in all honesty, Teddy Roosevelt was the first to go through and really try and find a middle ground. He wanted to keep all of that wild land that he had enjoyed, but he also wanted the United States to grow. Remember, we said this before. He was not anti-business. He was just against the things that were going to harm the American people. And he felt that the complete loss of all the wild land in the United States, all the forests and everything, was going to have a massive negative impact on the American people. And as such, he wanted to make sure that they were going to be protected and preserved for future generations. Like I said, not every square foot, but a big portion of it.